The spiritual principle that breaks the cycle of emotional pain stands as one of Carl Jung's greatest legacies to humanity. Have you ever wondered why we remain trapped in repetitive patterns of suffering? Why, despite our best efforts, we return to the same self-destructive behaviors? Jung discovered that there exists a transformative force within each of us capable of interrupting this vicious cycle. A principle so powerful that, when truly understood, fundamentally changes our relationship with pain. This is not just another psychological technique, but a revolution in the way we understand our own shadow and inner light. Prepare to discover how this forgotten principle can free you from the invisible chains that keep you tied to the past and open the way to a life of authenticity and fulfillment that you may never have imagined possible. The journey toward emotional freedom begins with recognizing the invisible prison we've constructed around ourselves. Carl Jung understood that human suffering rarely exists in isolation. It operates in cycles, patterns that repeat with almost mathematical precision throughout our lives. These cycles are not random misfortunes, but complex psychological structures that form what Jung called complexes, emotional patterns charged with psychic energy that operate autonomously within our unconscious mind. Consider how often you've found yourself in the same emotional predicament, despite circumstances appearing different on the surface. The relationship changes, the job changes, the environment changes, yet somehow the same emotional wound reopens. This is the invisible prison Jung identified, not a physical confinement, but a psychological one that limits our capacity for growth and authentic living. At the core of these recurring patterns lies what Jung termed the pain body, accumulated emotional suffering that becomes an energetic entity within us, feeding on similar emotional experiences and perpetuating itself through our unconscious behaviors. This pain body doesn't want healing. Paradoxically, it seeks situations that will reactivate the familiar pain, creating a perverse comfort in suffering we recognize rather than growth we don't. The initial construction of these emotional cycles often begins in childhood. Early experiences with caregivers create what Jung called imprints on our psyche, foundational emotional patterns that become templates for future relationships and experiences. A child who learns that love is conditional may spend a lifetime unconsciously selecting partners who reinforce this belief, perpetuating a cycle of emotional abandonment despite consciously desiring security. What makes these prisons particularly insidious is their invisibility. We don't see the bars that contain us. Instead, we experience them as reality itself. Jung emphasized that we don't simply have these patterns. In many ways, these patterns have us. They dictate our perceptions, color our experiences, and ultimately determine our responses to life's challenges in ways that remain beneath conscious awareness. The autonomy of these emotional complexes explains why willpower alone rarely breaks these cycles. You might consciously decide to respond differently to a trigger, only to find yourself enacting the same pattern when emotions intensify. This isn't weakness or failure. It's evidence of the complex's autonomous nature operating beyond conscious control. Jung observed that these emotional cycles gain power through denial and avoidance. The parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, what he called the shadow, don't disappear, but rather gain influence from the darkness of unconsciousness. The emotions we suppress don't dissipate, they condense and intensify. The thoughts we refuse to examine don't vanish. They burrow deeper into our psyche, where they operate unrestrained by conscious awareness. Breaking free from this invisible prison requires first acknowledging its existence. Jung advocated for unflinching self-observation, the courage to witness our patterns without judgment or denial. This is not mere intellectual understanding, but a profound emotional recognition that often arrives as an aha moment, a sudden clarity that what we've been experiencing as random misfortune is actually a cycle we've been unconsciously perpetuating. The emotional cycles that trap us commonly revolve around core themes: abandonment, betrayal, rejection, shame, or unworthiness. These aren't simply reactions to current events, but complex responses triggered by activation of old wounds. When we respond to present circumstances with disproportionate emotion, Jung would say we're experiencing a constellation, the activation of an emotional complex that merges past and present into a single overwhelming experience. Freedom begins with developing what Jung called psychological distance, the ability to observe our emotional reactions without being completely identified with them. This doesn't mean detachment or suppression, but rather developing the capacity to witness our patterns with compassionate awareness. In Jung's words, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The invisible prison of emotional cycles persists largely because we mistake our conditioned responses for our authentic selves. We say, "This is just how I am," rather than recognizing, "This is the pattern I've learned." Jung emphasized that beneath these conditioned responses lies our true nature, what he called the self with a capital S, the integrated whole being that exists beyond our wounds and conditioning. The first step toward liberation from these cycles is radical honesty, the willingness to see ourselves as we truly are, not as we wish to be seen. This is not self-judgment, but self-illumination. By bringing light to the unconscious patterns that drive our suffering, we begin to loosen their grip. As Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul." The good news, Jung discovered, is that recognition itself begins the process of transformation. The very act of consciously witnessing a pattern creates a small but significant space between stimulus and response, a crack in the walls of our invisible prison through which light can enter. This is where the spiritual principle Jung identified begins its powerful work, not by fighting against our emotional cycles, but by fundamentally changing our relationship to them. The journey beyond emotional suffering requires courage, not the kind that faces external dangers, but the profound courage to confront what lies within. Carl Jung articulated this crucial step as the confrontation with the shadow, a process he considered the gateway to genuine psychological and spiritual transformation. The shadow, as Jung defined it, encompasses all the parts of ourselves that we have disowned, repressed, or denied. Our unacknowledged emotions, impulses, desires, and qualities that contradict our conscious self-image. This shadow material doesn't vanish when banished from consciousness. Rather, it accumulates power in the darkness of our unconscious mind. Like water building pressure behind a dam, these repressed aspects eventually demand expression, often erupting in ways that perpetuate our emotional pain. What makes shadow work particularly challenging is that we've invested considerable energy in keeping these aspects of ourselves hidden, not just from others, but from our own awareness. The shadow often contains qualities deemed unacceptable by our family, culture, or society. Perhaps as a child, you learned that expressing anger was forbidden, that vulnerability was dangerous, or that certain desires were shameful. In response, you buried these aspects, creating what Jung called a persona, the acceptable face you present to the world. This persona may have secured belonging and approval, but at the cost of wholeness. The elements you've rejected don't disappear. They become shadow content. Jung observed that what we deny within ourselves doesn't simply lie dormant. It gets projected onto others with remarkable precision. the qualities that trigger intense emotional reactions in us, particularly disproportionate. Negative responses often reveal our shadow material. The person you inexplicably detest, whose mannerisms irritate you beyond reason, may be displaying shadow aspects you've disowned within yourself. As Jung famously stated, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This mechanism of projection creates much of our recurring emotional pain. We enter relationships unconsciously seeking people who will carry our disowned qualities, then react with pain and surprise when these very qualities emerge to wound us. The critical parent we rejected within becomes the critical partner we attract without. The vulnerability we couldn't accept in ourselves becomes the weakness we despise in others. These projections create perfect conditions for perpetuating emotional suffering. The confrontation with the shadow begins with what Jung called withdrawing projections, recognizing that our intense emotional reactions to others often reveal more about our inner landscape than external reality. This doesn't deny legitimate grievances, but acknowledges that our emotional responses contain valuable information about our own psychology. When someone provokes an intense emotional reaction, Jung would invite us to ask, what part of myself am I seeing in this person that I've refused to acknowledge? Shadow material commonly clusters around specific themes that drive emotional suffering. The need for control often shadows deep vulnerability. Perfectionism frequently masks fear of inadequacy. Chronic people-pleasing may conceal repressed anger and resentment. Self-sacrifice often hides disowned needs. By recognizing these patterns, we can begin tracing our emotional pain to its source in shadow material. The work of shadow integration requires specific practices that Jung developed. The first is active imagination, a conscious dialogue with shadow aspects that allows these disowned parts to speak. Rather than analyzing from a distance, Jung encouraged engaging with shadow elements as distinct entities with their own perspectives. This might involve journaling a conversation with your anger, your fear, or your shame, not as intellectual analysis, but as genuine dialogue that acknowledges the shadow's valid perspective. Dreams provide another crucial avenue for shadow work. Jung considered dreams the natural language of the unconscious, often presenting shadow material through characters, scenarios, and symbols. The hostile figures, threatening situations, or uncomfortable emotions in dreams frequently represent shadow aspects seeking integration. By working with dream content rather than dismissing it, we create channels for shadow material to emerge into consciousness in constructive ways. The emotions we find most difficult to bear often contain the most significant shadow material. Jung noted that emotional triggers, those moments when we react with intensity disproportionate to the situation, provide perfect opportunities for shadow work. When you find yourself overwhelmed by rage, shame, jealousy, or fear, Jung would encourage pausing to ask, what disowned part of myself is being activated right now? This question shifts our focus from external blame to internal understanding. The confrontation with the shadow isn't about self-condemnation, but about reclaiming psychological energy and capacity. Each disowned aspect represents vital life force, trapped in unconsciousness. The anger we've repressed contains energy needed for healthy boundaries. The vulnerability we've rejected holds capacity for authentic connection. The selfishness we've condemned might harbor healthy self-care. By integrating these aspects, we recover psychological resources needed for emotional healing. Jung recognized that shadow work involves moral challenges as we confront aspects of ourselves that may contradict our ethical ideals. Yet he maintained that genuine morality emerges not from repression, but from conscious choice. We cannot choose not to act on impulses we refuse to acknowledge. True ethical development comes from recognizing all that exists within us and choosing consciously how to express these energies. rather than being unconsciously driven by them. The confrontation with the shadow makes visible the invisible forces, driving our emotional cycles. The patterns we've experienced as fate become recognized as consequences of unconscious dynamics we can now address. This doesn't mean the shadow disappears. Jung was clear that the shadow remains a permanent archetype within the psyche. Rather, our relationship with the shadow transforms from unconscious possession to conscious engagement. This work requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, the capacity to acknowledge contradictory aspects of ourselves without immediately resolving the contradiction. We are both loving and hateful, selfish and generous, courageous and fearful. The ability to hold these opposites creates psychological space where transformation becomes possible. In Jung's words, the greater the contrast, the greater the potential. Great energy only comes from a correspondingly great tension of opposites. The spiritual dimension of shadow work emerges as we recognize that wholeness, not perfection, is the goal of psychological development. Jung distinguished sharply between the perfectionistic ego ideal that rejects shadow material and the authentic self that embraces the fullness of human experience. This shift from perfection to wholeness aligns with many spiritual traditions that emphasize acceptance rather than achievement as the path to liberation from suffering. As shadow integration progresses, emotional pain begins to transform. What once triggered overwhelming reactions becomes material for growth. The situations that once seemed to repeat endlessly acquire new meaning and possibility. By confronting the shadow, we initiate the alchemical process Jung identified as essential to breaking the cycle of emotional suffering. The transformation that occurs not by escaping our darkness, but by bringing it into the light of consciousness. Individuation stands as the cornerstone of Jung's approach to psychological and spiritual development, a concept so profound that he dedicated much of his life's work to articulating its dimensions. More than a mere psychological theory, individuation represents the spiritual principle Jung discovered that truly breaks the cycle of emotional pain. At its essence, individuation is the process of becoming who you truly are, beneath the layers of conditioning, adaptation, and collective expectations that have shaped your conscious identity. Unlike many psychological approaches that focus primarily on symptom reduction or behavioral change, Jung's concept of individuation addresses the root cause of recurring emotional suffering, the fundamental disconnection from our authentic self. This self, which Jung intentionally capitalized, isn't simply the ego or personality, but rather the totality of who we are, encompassing both conscious and unconscious elements in a balanced, integrated whole. The journey toward this wholeness constitutes the path of individuation. The emotional pain that persists in cycles throughout our lives often stems from what Jung called violations against the self, moments when we've betrayed our authentic nature to secure approval, safety, or belonging. Perhaps you pursued a career that pleased your parents rather than following your genuine interests. Maybe you adopted beliefs or values that earned social acceptance rather than expressing your true perspective. These compromises, while sometimes necessary for survival, create internal fragmentation that manifests as recurring emotional distress. Jung observed that individuation unfolds in distinctive phases throughout life. The first half of life necessarily involves developing a functional ego and adapting to collective expectations, building a persona that allows us to function in society. The emotional suffering that emerges in midlife often signals the beginning of the second phase, the call to individuation, when the self begins pressing for expression beyond adaptive functions. This transition frequently arrives as what we now call a midlife crisis, the uncomfortable recognition that the life we've built may not reflect who we truly are. What makes individuation particularly powerful for breaking cycles of emotional pain is its paradoxical nature. While the ego seeks to escape suffering, individuation invites us to move through it with consciousness. Jung frequently cited the alchemical phrase, in stercor invenitur, in filth it will be found, to express how the gold of authentic selfhood often emerges precisely through confronting what we've most wanted to avoid. Our recurring emotional wounds contain the very material needed for transformation. The process unfolds through engagement with what Jung termed the transcendent function, the psyche's inherent capacity to produce unifying symbols that bridge conscious and unconscious, creating new psychological positions beyond previous limitations. These symbols emerge spontaneously in dreams, imagination, and creative expression when we maintain conscious relationship with unconscious material rather than suppressing it. Through this relationship, opposites that seemed irreconcilable, such as strength and vulnerability or spirituality and embodiment, find integration. Jung emphasized that individuation doesn't mean isolation or self-absorption, as is sometimes misunderstood. Rather, authentic individuation leads to deeper, more meaningful connection with others. As he wrote, individuation does not shut one out from the world, but gathers the world to oneself. When we relate from our authentic self rather than our persona, we discover genuine intimacy beyond the performances and projections that characterized previous relationships. This transformation of relating patterns breaks cycles of emotional pain that stemmed from inauthentic connections. The spiritual dimension of individuation becomes evident in its orientation toward meaning rather than comfort. Jung recognized that the psyche seeks not pleasure or pain avoidance, as Freud suggested, but meaning, the sense that our experiences, including our suffering, serve a purpose in our development. Through individuation, recurring patterns of emotional pain acquire teleological significance. They become understood not just as problems to eliminate, but as signposts guiding us toward wholeness. This reframing transforms our relationship with suffering. Jung described specific practices that facilitate individuation, central among them active imagination, the conscious engagement with unconscious material through dialogue, artistic expression, movement, or writing. Unlike passive fantasy, active imagination involves maintaining ego consciousness while allowing unconscious content to emerge and interact with consciousness. Through this practice, we develop relationship with inner figures that carry disowned aspects of the self, gradually integrating these elements into a more complete identity. Dreams play a crucial role in the individuation process, providing unfiltered communication from the unconscious about our developmental needs and trajectory. Jung distinguished between compensatory dreams that balance conscious attitudes and prospective dreams that point toward future development. By attending to dream material with curiosity rather than analysis, we receive guidance from the self about our next steps in breaking cycles of emotional suffering. This guidance often appears in symbolic form, speaking the soul's natural language. Synchronicities, meaningful coincidences without causal connection, serve as another avenue for individuation. Jung observed that during significant psychological transitions, synchronistic events often increase, creating bridges between inner and outer reality. These experiences suggest that psychological development aligns with a larger order, what Jung tentatively called the unus mundus, or unified reality. Recognizing synchronicities in our lives helps break emotional cycles by revealing patterns of meaning beyond personal suffering. The challenges of individuation reflect what Jung called the hero's journey, the archetypal pattern of departure from the familiar, confrontation with challenges, and return with expanded consciousness. This mythological framing helps normalize the difficulties encountered in breaking emotional cycles, placing personal suffering within a universal context. The hero's journey isn't about eliminating pain, but transforming through it, emerging with gifts that benefit both self and community. Individuation requires releasing identification with collective norms and expectations, what Jung termed de-identification from the collective. This doesn't mean rejecting society, but developing psychological independence that allows discernment between authentic impulses and adapted responses. Many emotional cycles persist because we remain unconsciously identified with collective patterns, family systems, or cultural narratives that restrict our authentic expression. Breaking these cycles requires recognizing where we've substituted collective values for personal truth. Critical to the individuation process is what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, maintaining conscious awareness of contradictory impulses, beliefs, or feelings without prematurely resolving the contradiction. This capacity creates psychological space where the transcendent function can operate, producing creative solutions beyond either-or thinking. Many emotional cycles persist because we vacillate between polarities rather than integrating them. Between excessive control and abandonment, rigid boundaries and none, intellectualization and emotional flooding. As individuation progresses, the recurring patterns of emotional pain gradually transform. What once seemed like meaningless suffering acquires purpose within our broader development. Triggers that previously produced automatic reactions become opportunities for conscious choice. Relationships governed by projection and repetition evolve toward authenticity. The energy formerly consumed by repression and defense becomes available for creative expression. These changes manifest Jung's spiritual principle in action, the movement from fragmentation toward wholeness that breaks the cycle of emotional pain. The individuation journey never concludes completely. Jung described it as an asymptotic process that approaches but never fully reaches its goal. This perspective offers both humility and hope in addressing emotional suffering. We recognize that complete freedom from pain isn't the objective, but rather a transformed relationship with our humanity that embraces both light and shadow in conscious integration. In Jung's words, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." The wounds that refuse to heal are not your enemies, but rather the very doorways through which your authentic self emerges when you finally have the courage to walk through them.